Hi everyone, welcome back to another SimplePlanes video. This video is part 1 of a new series on how to XML mod and how to code in SimplePlanes. So, let's get started. Now, one important thing I'd like to mention about this series is there is already a useful guide or reference list on all the different functions and all the different elements of FunkyTree, which is SimplePlanes' coding language. But this series is mainly going to put part of this guide into a video format and give you some examples of the use of all these different functions. You could learn FunkyTrees using just the guide by itself, but I'm trying to make it easy to understand with some actual demonstrations. So with that out of the way, let's actually get started. So my first example, say I have a rotator with another block as like a build. Now, by all of its default settings, this rotator will work with VTOL and will rotate the block 90 degrees down and 90 degrees up at a speed of 50%. These are all the default settings in the properties menu, so the activation group is none, inputs VTOL, inverts no, and the range of motion is 90 and the speed is 50%. Now say I want to make it so I can only move this rotator if activation group 1 is active. That's pretty simple, I just set the activation group to 1. The observed behavior is when I try to move VTOL, nothing happens. When I activate 1, I can move it. Except when I deactivate 1, it's kind of locked there, which could be ideal for what you want to do. Say, in older builds, where you only had VTOL to play with, you could, say, set your flaps to activate group 1, extend those, then deactivate 1, and then, say, if you want to retract your landing gear then, activate 2, and then use VTOL to control your landing gear doors instead of using code. I guess there was no code back then. Then put landing gear up, then deactivate 2, then go to maybe 3, which is something else, and so on. We really just used VTOL and maybe trim for a lot of functions around the aircraft. We'd use different codes now. Or there's also current cases, I don't really know of any examples, but this behavior could be desirable where it locks it. Now say you wanted to make it so it essentially when you deactivated 1, then the rotator would go back to its default state, or 0. Before I go any further, I'd like to introduce you to XML Modding. I'm pretty sure many players will be familiar with XML Modding, but it's essentially where you modify any attribute or property of a part outside of its allowable state in the designer. So if I wanted to make range of motion go above 90, I guess less than 0 too, but above 90 mainly, I can't do that with the slider, but I can do that with XML Modding. XML Modding is essentially, at least where it got its name from, where you open up the craft's XML file in a text editor and modify the XML code, which is where it got its name from. You're modifying XML, which turns into XML modifying, and then XML Modding is short for that. Now we have a mod called Overload, which is actually built into the game now, where you can do all of this inside the game. And there's actually a good cheat sheet, which has a list of all of the different attributes and all of the different values. So I'm going to link that in the description, and recommend you refer to that, because that explains what all these are, what they do, and everything in here. I'm just going to show you the interface and how to go about it. So say I want to do what I said before, which is where I want to 0 here when I deactivate 1. Now, the way I'm going to do this is I need to add an attribute of the name 0 on deactivate with a value of true to the input controller. The input controller is essentially this category here in this rotator. For example, a different part, I'm just going to pick a random one. Let's say a gyroscope, that's a good one. You can see it has 3 different inputs, pitch input, roll input, and yaw input. This shows up as 3 input controllers in this drop-down menu. So when you want to modify something, you click on Overload, this menu appears. If you want to modify something in the part category, then you can just do that here. Or say you want to modify something in the input controller, you can click on Input Controller. And then you click on this button here to add a new value. And then the name is 0 on deactivate according to the cheat sheet. So I type in that. And then I set it to true. So yes, I want this to 0 on deactivate. You can also check if it worked by clicking out of overload and then going back into it. And it's still there, so it's definitely true. And you can see here that it just has a lowercase t. And I had a capital T, so it just changed that for me. So you can load the level and see what happens. So when I try to move VTOL, nothing happens. When I activate 1, it will work. I just need to go after fast forward. No, never mind. I just increased the speed of the rotator. Now, if I deactivate 1, you can see here it zeros. So that's one thing you can do. Now I'd like you to remember this setup. So we have activate 1, inputs VTOL, and we have 0 on deactivate true. I'd like you to remember that scenario for later. So let's say I want the input of this rotator to be activate 1. This is actually a question I've been asked on my other tutorial videos several times. So say, how do I make a rotator be activate 1 or some other activation group or something else? Let's go into the input controller and we want to change this to activate 1. Now you can't do this by just clicking input a bunch of times. There's only a few inputs that it cycles through. But there's an easy way to get around this, and this is where we're going to introduce coding. Now, XML modding by default, at least back in the old days, is just where you modified some of these values, so say mass scale or drag scale or some other ones, outside of the normal values, or in some cases where you couldn't actually modify these, you could modify them. So say if I change the range of motion to be, say, 100, that would be an example of XML modding. Now, coding is different to XML modding. Coding is where you're actually using funky trees, which is the coding language in SimplePlanes, to make a part do something that you just can't do by modifying the XML. Or it's recreating what you could do by just using code. And this is where I'd like to introduce another cheat sheet. It's more than just a cheat sheet, it's actually a guide in itself. I'm just going to use it as a reference list for all of the different variables, functions, and other things that I can't really remember. So say I want to make this rotator have an input of activate 1. The first thing I want to do is open up a menu where you can type in a custom input. The way I like to do it is I like to just hover over this button here, hold the control key on my keyboard and click on it, and it opens up this menu. Or say if you're on mobile and you can't do that, you can open up overload, select input controller from the drop down menu, and then here we are. So I'm just going to use this menu. Either way is fine though. And instead of VTOL, I'm going to type in activate 1, and capitalization is important, so lowercase a will not work, it has to be capital A. So right now it has an input of activate 1. I'm just going to set the speed back to 50, but other than that, nothing's changed. If we load the level, the first thing we observe is that even though we haven't done anything, this is off, it's rotated down. And then when we activate 1, it then rotates up. Now this could be what you want, but say we just want it to just go from like about here somewhere to about here. There's two ways we can do that. The first way is not one I'd recommend now, but it's, I guess, a good one for beginners. And it's where you see these two values, you set them in to 0. The other way is using more coding, which I'll explain in just a bit. So with a min of 0, you can see here it's not moving. When we activate 1, it's up. And that's outside behavior for now. What these two minimum and maximum values are doing is they're essentially multiplying our input. Now, drawing on what the funky trees guide says, activate 1 is a Boolean variable, which means it's true or false. Now this can be converted to a number, so false is -1, and true is just 1, or can be used as a Boolean for some selectors. Here it's converted to a number, so the input is -1 or 1, which is that behavior we were seeing before. Now an important thing is these min and max are not like limits, So say if our input exceeds 1, it doesn't just stop it at 1, it actually lets it go to 2. So I'm just going to give an example. So say your input is just 2, which is a bit of code. You can see here the maximum does not limit it, it just goes all the way to 2. It really scales it instead of limiting it. So go with activate 1 back in place. A minimum of 0 is multiplying -1 by 0, which is 0, and so it doesn't go past 0. And then since it's just 1 if it's true, then this maximum lets it just be 1, or a 90-degree angle. So that's one way to stop this behavior where it's like going past, like below where we want it to go. Now the other way is using code. Now if you've looked at the guide, then you'll know that a clamp is what we're looking for. But if you haven't, I'll just explain what a clamp does. So a clamp is basically X, or in this case activate 1, which is -1 or 1, clamped between a minimum and a maximum. So basically, it really just limits it. So say, instead of activate 1, I just have 3. So a clamp of 3, 1, 4 would output 3. So basically what this code is doing is it's first considering this value, and it's making sure that it's above 1 and less than 4. So if this value is 5, the output will be 4 because it's limited at 4. If it's, say, 0, it's not 0, it will be less than 1, so the output is just 1 because it's limiting it at 1. Now the other function is clamp O1, which just has one input, which is, say, in this case, activate 1. This is the same as clamp of something, so say clamp activate 1, 0, 1. The reason there's a separate function just for this is because clamp O1 is commonly used a lot in code. I guess it just increases performance, maybe. It's basically there because it's used a lot. There's probably another reason, but again, I don't really know. I'm going to use clamp O1 because that's kind of why it's there. The clamp O1 of activate 1. You also notice this input changes to funky. And if you click on that, without pressing any other keys, it'll open up this menu. So if you're on mobile, and you can see this says funky, then you can just tap on this and it will open this menu. Now, just like before, the observed behavior is that it just stays like this, then moves up like this. Now, remember that scenario before with the 0 on deactivate? Say we want that to happen here. We want to have VTOL as our main input, and we want it to deactivate when activate 1 is not active. Now, if we wanted it to lock it, then I would just say make the activation group be 1. Or actually, no, there's actually another way to do this using code. So, scenario 1, using coding. We want to lock the input of VTOL when activate 1 is not active. This is slightly complicated to explain, but the way I would do this is I would have smooth of VTOL, comma, and then activate 1, yes, 1, otherwise nothing. Let's break this code down. Smooth is a time-based function, and it follows VTOL, but at a rate of this value per second. So basically, a rate of 1 is 1 unit per second. If that even makes sense. What this code's doing, this part here, is activate 1 as a boolean, as I previously said, and then this question mark and this colon signifies a boolean selection operator. So if activate 1 is true, which it is, so yes, then make this be 1. Otherwise, or really if it's false, then have it be 0. So if activate 1 is active, then smooth it at 1, or we can actually just say a larger number to ensure that it completely follows VTOL. Otherwise, do not make it move at all. So as smooth as something by 0, it's just locking it in place. Observed behavior, we can use VTOL like this, but when we deactivate 1, it locks it in place. Now the other scenario is we want it to return to place when activate1 is deactivated. Now this code uses some standard math operators. And I don't think I've said this, but this is pretty important to consider. Function trees is all about getting numbers. So all these different functions, all of the operators, they're all about numbers. Even booleans can be converted to -1 and 1. So it's really all about numbers. Once you understand that, and you understand what all these functions are, then hopefully you should be able to just logically think through all the functions and generate different lines of code to suit different needs. So I want activate1 to basically multiply VTOL. So if clamp O1 activate1, which is either 0 or 1, it's important that it's 0 or 1. Otherwise there will be -1 or 1, and -1 just inverts it. Doesn't make it 0. Clamp O1 activate1 multiplied by VTOL. The observed behavior of this is we can use VTOL, and then when it's 0, it times it by 0, making it 0. Now say you have a bit of code, and you want to test it, but you don't really want to put it into a rotator, or say you constantly change things in it, and you can't be bothered trying to go to the level into the designer, put it in the rotator, go back into the level, test it, find one small thing and do it all over again. There is a way to do this. It's called the Debugging Expression tool, but I don't really know the actual name of it, but it's basically debugging the expression to test it in the development console. Now if you're on mobile, unfortunately, I'm not sure how to open this console on mobile. There could be a way, but I'm not really sure what it is. But if you're on PC, then you can press the tilde key on your keyboard, which is in the top left usually, and then you have this menu. I'm going to type debug expression, and this wants a string. Now, about quotes, if your expression has spaces in it, so say 1 space plus space 1, then you want to input a quote for it, and you only need to do 1 because you can see here it just kind of automatically adds the other one. You could do 2 if you want, but it's not necessary because it just does it for you. And as you can see, if we don't put quotes, it outputs an error. And if we have quotes with something that doesn't have spaces, then it actually removes them. So basically, rule of thumb, if it has spaces, add a quote before. If it doesn't, no quotes. So if we input that expression from before, clamp O1, activate 1, times VTOL, that shows up here, and you can see how it changes. Now the reason this is exactly what VTOL is, no matter how fast you move it, and this keeps moving slowly, is because the rules of the rotator still apply. So it still has a range of 90 and a speed of 50. Now I like to just make the speed be pretty high, like higher than 100%. I just dictate my speed using a smooth. But if you're just getting started, then there's no real need to. So now let's consider another example. We want to make this block oscillate between up and down if activate1 is on, and if it's off, then just return to 0. This is acting like a windshield wiper. And this code that we're going to develop can be used on actual windshield wipers, and in fact this code is used on the SW120's windshield wipers. Well, it's used in a part of them because they have 3 speeds, but the principle is the same. Now, consulting the guide again, I can see that an important function that I can consider is ping pong, and it basically makes sure our input is never larger than any number we want to put in, and never less than 0. Another important function is the sum function, which is said in the guide, the integration of x over time, but it's simply just the sum of an input over time. So if I debug that expression, just sum of, say, 1, you can see it increases. And another cool thing is if we put rate of the sum, so really the rate of change, it's essentially 1. I know it's not exactly 1, but that's a weird issue with SimplePlanes, but it's basically 1. So if you have a sum of something, the rate of that sum of something will be equal to the something. Now let's just have VTOL, in quotes, times say 5, and then ping pong, let's say between 0 and 1. You can see the VTOL slider isn't showing, but I can just use my arrow keys, so actually I'll make it based on trim, so you can actually see me using the slider. Actually, let's clear everything. So, debug expression of trim times 5, and then the ping pong of that and 1. So between 0 and 1, you can see that it's basically the same, like it is the same. But then as we cross 1, it starts to go down, such that when trim times 5 is equal to 2, the ping pong is 0. And then when between 2 and 3, the ping pong goes between 0 and 1, and then so on. That's a practical demonstration of how the ping pong function works. It's something similar to clamp, but it's a little different. So now let's put in sum. So I have the sum of just trim. I'm just going to put in the sum of trim as well, so you can compare them. You can see how the sum is affecting the ping pong. Now you can see that when I make the trim equal to 0, it doesn't actually go back to 0, which is one of the requirements of my problem. So I'm just going to use some more funky trees logic. I'm going to multiply this by clamper 1. Now I'm going to say activate 1, sum of clamp 01, activate 1. So basically, it oscillates when activate 1 is on, and then it's multiplied by 0, which is what this is here, making it 0 when activate 1 is off. So you can see here, when activate 1 is on, it oscillates, and then when activate 1 is off, it's 0, then turned on, it oscillates again. I can then put a smooth around it. I don't have to, but I'm going to because it's just a good idea, in case our rotator or whatever we're putting it into doesn't have speed on it. I'm just going to smooth it by 1, so it's always smooth and it's not just jumping. So I'm going to copy this expression, which we refined using the debug expression panel. I'm going to put this into a rotator. Observed behavior is that ping pongs or oscillates when activate 1 is on, and when it's off, it goes back to 0. The only issue is that when it's on again, I'll just get a good example. It kind of just jumps back and forth quickly. This can be solved using more coding, but I'm actually not sure how to fix that. Or at least, I'm not sure how to fix that with simple code I can explain. But for now, this code here is the code that solves that problem. So these are all some simple scenarios that you can use coding and XML modding to solve. So that will be it for this video. Hopefully you learned something. And in my next video, I will be showing you how to use the variable system with things like using switches for extra actuation groups, making basic and complicated startup sequences, and a few more things. So I hope you all enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!